The French sociologist Emile Durkheim said that one of the functions of punishment is it firms up our sense of group solidarity. So when our group's under threat for some reason, when our values are under threat, if we can create an out-group that it's legitimate to punish, we can reaffirm our sense of solidarity. I think we saw this a bit in the pandemic. Our sense of social solidarity was really in jeopardy, but sort of by definition, just social distancing. It's not a surprise that Boris Johnson, in the summer of 2020, in his speech about how we're going to recover from the pandemic, said he's building 10,000 new prison spaces, because it creates this us and them. It's a slightly different experience for me, because for me, this is kind of where the X was on that map of concentric circles. When I was growing up, my brother was in prison, and so was my dad and my uncle. My dad's from Liverpool, which I think at the time was quite a sort of a lot of poverty, quite a sort of crimogenic area. My mum's side of the family are from the East End, which has huge kind of historic adversarial relationship with the police, where you could be sort of excommunicated for talking to a copper. And so for me, I have a different relationship to this sort of out group. It's a complex one. It's not one necessarily of unconditional warmth and regard. I think I googled ambivalence, and I found this wonderful image. By ambivalence, I don't mean the way it's sometimes misused to say sort of detached or I don't care or a kind of shrug, but this sense of just having this kind of cacophonous attitude in your head, these multiple viewpoints. I was greatly pained by seeing my brother go to prison. It seemed totally unnecessary. The war on drugs wasn't going to get him to give up his heroin addiction. They couldn't possibly punish him more than he was punishing himself. At the same time, when my dad went away, I did feel a kind of relief. I felt like, well, actually, maybe I've become the person I am today because I had that bit of space, and I sort of lost this kind of overbearing, violent figure in the house. Yet, within all of that was this sense of it could have been me, or it will be me one day, a feeling of inherited guilt that I'm going to be visited by the same fate. And so I couldn't consider my dad's punishment without thinking, well, would I like to be punished that way? What would it do to me? How would it deform me further? How's it going to deform him further? So it was a really sort of messy state. What I want to do today is say what sort of vantage point that experience has given me on a more like social, political level when it comes to prisoners, and just what I've experienced at work and in my family. What happens when we exile people? So I told you about my family coming from the East End. My uncle Frank, when he was 14, did 3 months in a boar stall on remand. If anyone doesn't know about boar stalls, they're these kind of short, sharp shock regimes that they used to have, where teenagers would basically have to do hard labor, often very futile hard labor, such as digging holes that were 8 feet deep and then filling them back in at the end of the day. That was a very brutalizing experience for him. Shortly after he got out, he was in trouble with the police again. One night when he was 15, he broke into a corner shop to steal a crate of Coca-Cola cans. He's not really into Coca-Cola, but he's into the buzz of stealing from shops at that point. The police show up, they catch him. He's not a very good thief at this stage. And they think, well, Coca-Cola's not really much of a charge, but if we can say that he stole the cash box, or was trying to steal the cash box, then we can get a good charge here. So they sat him in the back of the police car, 2 police officers either side of him, and they needed to get his fingerprints on the cash box. So they grabbed his wrists and tried to prise open his hands. He just clenched them as tightly as he could in defiance, and they tried to peel them open and incriminate him. Now, I know lots of stories from the East End that are a bit like that. The police and ordinary people who just, it's a game and they hate each other. The response for someone like my uncle, coming from a working class family, no opportunities to kind of, very few opportunities to kind of escape this confrontation with the police, was he thought, well, if you want to see a criminal, I'll show you a criminal. And it's something that is so echoed in the likes of Pentonville or Brixton or Belmarsh for me. I hear people just sort of say this all the time, that when the state are telling you that you're awful, that you're criminal, when they're stigmatizing you like that, your way of taking charge of that situation sometimes is to try and be the worst possible thing you can be, worse than what even they think you are. Obviously, this has really negative effects for people's behavior and for society on the whole, if that's one of the only places they have to go. There's a man in the book called DK, and he talks about how when he's in prison, when he comes back to prison, he's been in and out for much of his life, he feels this kind of sense that he can relax. And it's not necessarily that he's talking about being overly institutionalized, although there may be some of that. What he's saying is, in prison, when I interact with people, when I don't know, lend someone a tea bag or a cigarette, or when I just chat to people on the landing, I'm just seen to be doing a nice thing to help someone out. Outside, it's like I'm stuck behind a two-dimensional existence where I can't break free. People are always interpreting me according to my criminality, that's fundamental. And he's flattened much more in the outside world, whereas in prison, let he who is without sin cast the first stone. People tend to see beyond your crime and see sort of who you are a bit more. So obviously the effects of exiling people is that they will make another community, but they will make a community amongst those who will accept them, which is sometimes a kind of criminal subculture. So I think the way we do things, our lack of affinity, familiarization, our casting out of the circle of prisoners is really harmful. It leads to more crime, pretty much. That then brings us to the question of, well, what would it mean to feel some kind of affinity or connection or human regard for someone in prison? That sounds a bit weird. I don't necessarily want to hold hands and sing Kumbaya with a murderer, it's... we can't be naive about this. We can't be naive about the fact that people can be very dangerous in prison, and they may be sort of quarantined from us for a good reason. I'm going to say that I think there's two things that need to change in order for us to, I think, have a bit more space and human regard for people in prison. One is to do with social and material change, which is really, really important. And the other is to do with a change of our attitudes, how we think about stuff, which, talking to people at a philosophy festival, I'd be really interested to see what you say about that in the Q&As. So on the social and material level, this is a more familiar sight in modern Britain. When I was growing up, I kept hearing this phrase from the kind of working class community I lived in, which is bed and breakfast, bed and breakfast. Prisons like bed and breakfast. I heard this deep resentment for the fact that prisoners were getting 3 meals a day. And at the moment, we are living in a country where people can go to work, they can work very long hours, they can work every day of the week, and they are skipping meals. So it's one of the sort of tragic ironies that the working classes are not always, but very often kind of punitive. They want tougher sentences. They want prison to be harsher. I don't take that at face value. There may be some people who do. I think that arises from the feeling of deprivation that people have in their own life. We talk about Norway and Scandinavia and these countries that seem to have really forward-thinking prisons with kind of therapeutic interventions and reintegration programs. The reason they can flourish is because people's quality of life in those countries is generally good. There are very few people in Norway who are jealous of someone in prison. And I think if we want to change our prisons, I think this is the general sort of abolitionist sentiment that we have to improve just social and material conditions across the board. The second thing that needs to change is a little bit more esoteric. It's to do, I think, with our kind of attitudes. In the book, there's a chapter called Luck, and it's about moral luck, and I'll explain what that is now. But I describe being in a classroom, and I tell my students about these two worlds that exist, these two imaginary worlds. One is a just world, where good things happen to good people, and bad things happen to bad people, and everything is as it should be. It's perfectly meritocratic. And the other is a luck world, where everything is random. Whether you are the judge or the prisoner, whether you're the king or the peasant, it's completely random. I think the national sport in the luck world would be snakes and ladders. If you win at snakes and ladders, it doesn't really mean anything. If you lose at snakes and ladders, it doesn't really mean anything. In the just world, I think chess would probably be their national sport. I don't know a lot about chess, so I'm going on a limb here, but as I understand it, it's a game with no random factors, except for who goes first. So its design is much more meritocratic. I think what's interesting and difficult about our world is it's at the murky borderlands of these two worlds. Is that justice plays a part, effort, merit, whether you did something good or bad or not, it's significant. But so is luck, right? So is where you're born in terms of the social economic hierarchy.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below. Or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.